Thank you for joining us today for this GHEX Research Committee's Spring Webinar Series sponsored by the Global Home Education Exchange. As we wait for everyone to join us, please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are joining us from. Thank you. We'll be starting shortly. And is our chat set up so everybody can communicate with each other as well as with the hosts and panelists? Make sure that when you do put something in the chat that you send it to everyone if it's for everyone to view. Welcome, everyone. Just feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'll be getting started shortly. All right, let's get started so we can reserve as much time as possible for our presenter today. On behalf of the Global Home Education Exchange, I would like to welcome you to today's research webinar. I'm Dr. Deborah Bell, Chair of the GHEX Research Committee. The Global Home Education Exchange is an international NGO with the purpose to connect and equip policymakers, researchers, and organizational leaders who are interested in home education. GHEX was founded with the purpose of advancing the freedom to home educate. GHEX affirms home education as a human right, regardless of a person's motivation or methodology. We work with a diverse group of leaders from all regions of the world and are organized through our committees of action, as well as our 4 regional committees for Asia Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Albert Cheng, Assistant Professor at the Department of Education Reform in the College of Education and Health Professions at the University of Arkansas. He will introduce our presenter and take your questions following the presentation. Dr. Cheng also serves as a GHEX Research Fellow. Our research fellows are accomplished academics with a scholarly body of research. They advise GHEX and are integral to our efforts to connect the academic community with the global home education movement. Our goal for our occasional research webinar series like this one is threefold. We want to bring to your attention new research that investigates or pertains to home education so that information we share with the press and policymakers is current and accurate. Secondly, we want to connect the academic community with practitioners and home education leaders around the world to foster understanding and exchange of information. And thirdly, we want to provide a model for emerging scholars to emulate as they prepare their own research studies and scholarly presentations. Along those lines, I'm pleased to announce that planning for the next GHEX Global Conference is underway, and we will be announcing more details shortly, but I can tell you it will take place in 2024. We will again provide monetary awards and travel stipends for the best original unpublished research projects, so get started. We will issue a formal call for papers shortly. With that, Albert, I will turn the webinar over to you and thank you once again for your contribution to these efforts. Dr. Chang.
Thanks, Deborah, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on wherever you're joining us from. So I'm delighted to introduce Angela Watson, who's our guest today. Dr. Angela Watson's a senior research fellow at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and assistant research professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Her research examines the impact of schooling and learning with an emphasis on homeschooling and informal learning outcomes on academic and socio-emotional outcomes. And so Dr. Watson has published in a variety of places, Education Researcher, the Journal of Human Resources, Journal of School Choice. Has also been featured in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Boston Globe. Actually, I encourage you to check out her blog post on homeschooling at Education Next. It was one of the most read posts in 2020, and maybe for pretty unsurprising reasons given the year that came out. But anyway, Dr. Watson's got her PhD from none other than the University of Arkansas right here at the Department of Education Reform. She also holds a master's and a bachelor's in elementary education and a graduate certificate in STEM education. And so before I turn it over to you, Angela, just reminders that we'll have some Q&A discussion time after Dr. Watson is done. If you have questions throughout her talk, please refer to the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your screen or wherever your floating kind of control panel bar for Zoom is. And just type in your question there. And when it comes to Q&A time, I'll moderate those questions. So anyway, Angela, thanks for being here. I want to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm super glad to be here. Thank you for having me, Albert and Deborah Bell, and I'm excited to get to present a little bit about my research on homeschooling. So as Albert said, I work at Johns Hopkins School of Education in the Institute for Education Policy. My daily work, I work across all sectors of K-12 education. I'm currently involved in a project with GHEX looking at math, curriculum materials in public schools. We're doing an evaluation with the Walton family or the Walton Foundation for charter schools in Kansas City. So I work across all different types of education, not just homeschooling, but my personal research has kind of focused on homeschooling for almost a decade now. It's something that's been interesting to me to study as a researcher. I think it's important to say I was not homeschooled. I don't homeschool my own children. They attend traditional public schools. I don't really have any friends that are close to me who are homeschooling right now. And so, I don't consider myself necessarily an advocate for homeschooling, although I'm certainly not anti-homeschooling, but I really do come to it as a researcher. And so that is what I try to portray in my work. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about a project that I've been working on homeschool growth, retention, and participation around the time and post-pandemic, around the time of the pandemic and post-pandemic. And I'm going to go through that with you. And then I'm hoping to also talk to you about a related project that we're doing at Johns Hopkins. We're calling it the Hopkins Homeschool Hub. And it's in development right now, but I've been very excited to come and talk to everyone today, hoping to get some input from the research community about what would be helpful and high value that we could include in this homeschool hub, which I'll explain at the end. And currently there's no plan to have any kind of international component, but it is certainly something that I'm open to. And so if someone has suggestions for that, I would be interested in hearing that as well. So I'll start off with this and then we can talk at the end about the other bits. So homeschool growth, retention, and participation. Oh, it is not scrolling for me, sorry. There we go. Okay, so homeschool participation pre-pandemic. So before the pandemic in the United States, homeschool participation was estimated to be at around, I think the official estimate was 2.7%. We're all friends, so we're going to use round numbers and call it 3%, but around 3% of all K-12 US students participated in homeschooling. And around 2016 to 2018, we saw that the slow growth in homeschooling that homeschooling had experienced for a couple of decades began to slow and even stalled out. So there was very, very small growth, and that growth was not statistically significant. And so folks thought, homeschooling had finally cooled off and that was the end of growth in homeschooling in the United States. Now, these were based on the national estimates, and there are several reasons that people said, that the federal estimates were incorrect. And so some of those are that we have a small sample problem with homeschooling in nationally representative samples, because we have hundreds of thousands of people answering surveys about what kinds of schooling they participate in. And out of those, maybe only 300 to 500 are actually homeschoolers. And so we think, that's a very small sample to be basing large numbers off of. We also think that there's probably some reporting bias going on, that homeschoolers may be less likely to have responded to the survey, or that certain types of homeschoolers may have been less likely. And so that may introduce some bias into these estimates. And then finally, there were changes in these survey methods and in the survey questions over time. And so even the NCES would say, do not compare this year to the prior year because we've changed some things. And of course, the general population ignores all of those warnings and just reports out on the differences or the lack of growth, right? So we do have better counts than these estimates. And so using actual counts of state participation, I published a paper in 2018 using data from 2015 with 23 states that do collect homeschool participation data. And 20 of those states had continuous data. So there's a map, and those are the green states where we had data. So instead of using these estimates, I tried to look at states with data to see if this homeschooling had really cooled off. And here is the blue chart with the summary. And we do see that there is growth over time, at least in these 20 states. Now, it's 20 states. And so are those 20 states generalizable to the other 30 that we have missing? We don't know. But we do think that in the United States context, at least, the reason that we have data for those 20 or 26 states is because the government requires homeschoolers to file some sort of report every year, or when they begin homeschooling, they must report that they're homeschooling and how many students they're schooling. In the states for which we do not have data, it's because those states do not have any such requirement. And so we think that in states where there are lower requirements for parents to have to jump through some sort of regulatory hoops, that would be more conducive to homeschooling than in states where there are more regulatory burden that the parents have to fill out paperwork, et cetera, to report homeschooling. So we think that it's likely that homeschool participation is at least equal to, if not higher, in states where we do not have data because of the regulatory context that is the reason we don't have the data. So, for whatever that's worth, that is what we came up with again in 2018. So this is where we were in 2018. Then the pandemic happened and we all lived through this. And certainly COVID, was devastating to many people, but it was certainly a golden hour for growth in homeschooling and awareness, I think, of homeschooling. Popular media reports of these massive increases, exodus from closed public schools, private schools, and parents were really taking things into their own hands and figuring out how to educate their children at home. The US Census did a pulse survey and again estimated participation to be at around 11%. So very high, compared to the 2.5–3% pre-pandemic, huge increases. But policy wonks said, we don't really believe that. There's problems with the question, what is homeschooling proper versus what is schooling students from home, and would parents be confused about the differences there? were they homeschooling, or were they simply their students were learning from home, but they were learning using Zoom and the traditional public school curriculum or something, right? And so everybody said, or the policy wonks, many of them said, we don't believe these pulse estimates, although they did believe the NCS earlier estimates with similar problems, but they didn't believe the pulse estimates. And they said, yes, but participation is going to go back to normal as soon as the pandemic is over. We're really not that concerned about homeschooling. So this paper really looks at what has happened. All right. So in this study is an update of the Is Homeschool Cool paper, is looking at new data. So current data, and then 34 states. So we've added another dozen states. We are still collecting data, trying to get some data from a couple other states, but right now this is where we are. So we have data from all of these states in red. We have 18 states where we have data from as far as near as 21-22 academic school year. And then we have 9 states with data in the 22-23 academic school year. So this provides us with information about growth around the time of the pandemic, but it also can help us look at post-pandemic retention and how many students really are staying in homeschooling after the schools reopened and they could return to whatever it was they were doing before. All right, so that's what we're going to look at: growth, retention, and participation. Participation is comparisons across sector. So looking at really, we have 5-6% of kids in homeschooling now. What exactly does that look like compared to charter school, private school, et cetera? And then, considering some of the policy implications of this as well. So a few issues, and I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cough this week, and so if I mute to cough, I'm sorry, but my voice gets weak. So a few issues, limitations with what we're talking about. States all collect these data in different ways, and they all report these data in different ways, and that's problematic when we're trying to compare across states. So for example, Oregon and Kansas only collect parents who are entering homeschooling for the first time, so new applications. So those numbers do not indicate the total number of homeschoolers in that state. They only indicate the number of new homeschoolers. So we can't use those for total participation, but we can use those to look at trends over time of new applications at least. It's also unclear how much accountability there is if you choose not to report a new application, if they're really coming after people or if they just let it slide. So it's unclear, what that really represents, but it is what it is. It's imperfect, and we have to use it as best we can. Also, states report at different times of year, and we're going to see this in Arkansas. I work remotely from Arkansas, and it's my home state, and so it's one that I will reference often. In Arkansas, they report in the fall for that academic school year, how many students they have that are homeschooling. Then they report again around the new year, and then they will report again at the end of the year of the academic school year. And so the number keeps going up over time. And we see this with other states as well, where they may report the prior academic year's total schooling in June or July or even August. And so it's a little tricky trying to figure out exactly what year the numbers are actually referring to. So I do my best to account for that, open to ideas. So first, we're going to look at just overall growth, increases in homeschooling participation. And I've chosen 3 states just to kind of highlight because they're interesting, but I have these types of charts for each of our states for which we have data. So the first state is Arkansas. You can see homeschool participation, just raw counts over time from 2000 to 2021. And you see, marked growth around the time of the pandemic. 2020 indicates 2020-21 school year, and then 21 is for the 21-22 school year. So you can see, significant growth there. Here we have Florida. You can see their growth over time. Also, large growth around the time of the pandemic. And then here we have Maine. Now it's interesting to point out in Maine, if you look closely, a huge growth, but the growth is in 21-22 academic school year. And so that is because of the way they report their participation is later into the year. And so I believe that this indicates really the participation should be reflected in 2021 academic school year, but that's not how they account for it. My decision was to just report the states as they report the data. And that way, other researchers that come behind me can figure out if they want to change that. And we'll talk about a little bit in the analysis going forward, how I've kind of tried to account for that as well. But there are differences, and this is an example that we see and where people are reporting and when. So here are all of the states that we have in our data set and their growth over time. However, we have states dropping in and out. You see a couple dips around 2013-14. These are states where there are missing data for a year or maybe 2 years for whatever reason. And so it's difficult to try to roll this up into some sort of overall estimate because folks are coming in and out of the data over time. So to account for that, I took the 26 states for which I have the most consistent data. There were a couple that I had to impute a value, and I chose whatever was the nearest year for which I did have data, and if there were 2 nearby years, I used whatever was lowest to try to not bias upwards the estimates. And so on this chart, 2019 has the red line that indicates COVID. Yes, I know that COVID occurred in 2020 spring, but this is the 2019-20 academic school year. So that's why the bar is there. And then you see the growth of all of the 26 states with consistent data from 2010 to 2021. And we see these 2 consistent bumps in or increases in homeschool participation right around the time of the pandemic. Now, what I did, I took a look at average growth over time. So average growth from 2010 to 2018-19, there was about a 4% average annual increase. But when I look at 2018-19 to 2020 or 2019-20, right, the first year of the spring of COVID, there was an 8% increase. And so because this is a double increase from prior years, this leads me to believe that 2019-20 data do contain a lot of the COVID increase that we're seeing, right? And so this is because if all of the numbers had been reported in the fall, 2019 would have been pretty clean and would have been an appropriate baseline year. But because we see this higher percentage of homeschool increase, then it leads me to believe that these are COVID growth numbers. And so I've backed off my baseline year for comparison. I'm using 2018-19, right? So that is what I'm considering the before COVID year with these data in this case. All right. So now looking, using that 2018-19 as our base year for comparison, comparing the participation in 2018-19 to the participation in 2021, which would have been the first full year of COVID, we see a 37% increase in homeschooling participation across these 26 states where we have consistent data. And then post-pandemic, comparing the 2018-19 base year to the 2021-22 academic school year, we see a 48% increase in total homeschool participation in these states. So obviously huge increases in homeschooling participation. Okay, so now we're going to look at the retention, right? So this story that, all of these folks are going to go back to whatever it was they were doing before. They're not really going to stay in homeschooling. And so we as policymakers don't need to worry about it. Excuse me. Okay, so we're going to look at Arkansas first. As I said, that's my home state, and I always just kind of start there out of default. The reason the final bar is red is because that is the partial year count. That's not our full year count. I don't have that yet. And so it's not complete, but we know it's at least that many and probably significantly more. But looking at comparing the base year of 2018-19 to 2021, which would have been the first full year of the pandemic, homeschooling participation in Arkansas grew about almost 10,000 students. That's the same amount of growth as happened in the prior 19 years. And so that's pretty amazing growth in a 2-year span. 1 year post-pandemic, they lost about 62 students. So they basically retained all of their homeschoolers 1 year after the pandemic. And then 2 years post-pandemic, we see that they still have retained a good deal of their students. And again, we don't have the final number, so I don't know exactly how many students they have, but it gives us a nice view of what retention is likely to look like, at least in states similar to Arkansas. Next, we look at Florida. For Florida, I don't have the 22-23 school year data at all, so we're only able to look 1 year post-pandemic. But from 2018-19 to 2020-21, they gained nearly 50,000 homeschool students in Florida. 1 year post-pandemic, not only did they retain all of those students, they gained another almost 9,000 students in the 1 year post-pandemic. And again, we don't know what's happened as far as the current school year, and I'll be very interested to see. And then also looking at Maine, Maine grew by about 5,000 students. Again, more growth than they had had in homeschooling in the prior 20 years. And then 1 year post-pandemic, they lost about 1,100 students. So clearly, folks are staying in homeschooling who have moved to homeschooling by the large majority, at least in these states. And then to get a more comprehensive look, I rolled up the states for where we do have 2 year post-pandemic data. We have 8 of those states with full counts. I didn't use Arkansas because it's a partial count. So I did roll up those states where I have 2 years post-pandemic data. And again, looking at that, we can kind of get a view of what the retention looks like. And again, accounting for that the 2019-20 school year is part of the homeschool growth year from the pandemic. If we look from 2018 to 2022, we see evidence that students are staying in homeschooling post-pandemic. So now we'll look at participation comparisons. So for me, this was really interesting. I think that a lot of people, even in the United States and even in education policy circles and even in school choice circles, are unaware of how many homeschoolers there really are. And if I go up to somebody and say, did you know that there are 6% of all K-12 students in the United States homeschool? Renowned professors who study education will say, no, I didn't know that. And if I say, did you know that there are as many homeschooled students as private schooled students in Arkansas? They will say, no, I did not know that. And so this work really kind of tries to call out that and look at it in a more explicit way. Okay, excuse me. So national estimates from NCES, et cetera, have homeschool participation, which is the HSP. Homeschool participation estimated at around 5.4%. And again, whatever problems there may be with those estimates, that's what the federal government's saying right now. Charter school participation is estimated to be at around 6%. Private school participation has gone down since the pandemic and is around 7.5%. And then private funding mechanisms that folks use to fund their school vouchers and ESAs and these types of things, only 1 to 2% of students in America use those. And so it's really interesting how much we hear about ESAs and how much we hear about vouchers or how much we hear about charters and all of the arguing and the policy. And yet we very rarely hear that much about homeschool policy. So I think that most policymakers are unaware of these percentages and looking at it this way. So when I started this work, again, I chose Arkansas because it's my home state. I started looking at homeschool participation. Arkansas has 6% homeschool participation on average, 6% charter school, and only 5% private school. And I was so excited because I really thought I had found something, that there were more homeschool students in America after the pandemic than we had in private schools. And I got really excited when I started looking at this data, but it turns out Arkansas is kind of an outlier. We'll discuss that a little bit more, but in Arkansas, we do have more kids in homeschooling than private schooling. In Arkansas, we also have less than 1% of students currently on privately funded vouchers or ESAs. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. When we turn to Florida, our other state, we've got homeschool participation, and in this case, it's 4.5%. So it's a percentage point lower than the national average. Charter schooling is very high at 11%, so almost double the national average. Private schooling also high, and then private funding is also high. And so I think that this points out a really important consideration in homeschool research. And when we're looking at these comparisons, I think that the school choice context is very important. I think that the schooling landscape overall is very important. So in Arkansas, it's a more rural state. People are more spread out. We're also poor. And so access to private schooling, we don't have the money for that. And we also can't get to a private school. Hence, and also there aren't very many private schools for all of those reasons. However, in Arkansas, they just passed a universal private funding ESA. And so I think it would be a really interesting research to look at how homeschool participation changes over time as this private funding mechanism is introduced and rolled out over time in Arkansas. Similar context to Florida. We see the evidence of this already kind of played out in Florida. Florida has a very robust school choice landscape and has had for several years. And then so that's why we see this large number for private funding, this large percentage of students using private funding. And that is also feeds into the large number of privately schooled students, because now you've funded kids who probably couldn't have afforded it otherwise. And because students in Florida have these different choices, it's likely that it's driving down the homeschool participation number in that state, which is below the national average. So I think that these things are really working together, and that it's an interesting potential research project for someone to look at, like how these things move together and what difference that makes. Okay, so here are all of the other states, the participation rates, and just little bar graphs. And it's just really interesting. You know, you're welcome to look at this in more detail, but I think what's most interesting here is just to see the variation, that there's just so much difference across the different sectors in the United States. And, you know, again, these are just for the states we have data for. I'm getting ready to do a project in Kansas City, Missouri, looking at charter schools. It's a large urban district, you know, notoriously and historically failing schools. 50% of their students attend charter schools. I'm getting ready to talk on a panel in Atlanta public schools, also about charter schools. Only 12% of their students attend charter schools. So there's a lot of variation across these sectors by the different states. I just think that's interesting. And then I have a few maps for you. So here's homeschool participation across the country. The light blue states have 0 to 3% homeschool participation of total K-12 population in their state. The medium blue are 4 to 6%. And then there's only one state in the United States for which we have data that we know of that has over 7% homeschool students. That's North Carolina. And I think they have 8% of their students are homeschooled. Unclear exactly why that is. I have a graduate student who's in North Carolina who's going to be looking at this. And so maybe she can shed some information on this for us. But interesting view of homeschool participation in general. This is homeschool participation in states where it is equal to or greater than charter school participation. So several states that have as many kids in homeschooling as in charter schools. In the Great Plains states, there are a couple states in there that have no charter schools at all. So, you know, obviously any homeschoolers would be more than their charter schools because there are none, but still an interesting comparison. And then finally, homeschool participation in states where there are more homeschoolers than private schoolers. And so again, two outliers, Arkansas, which we discussed earlier, and North Carolina, both have more kids in homeschools than in private schools, which I just think is super, super interesting. And that, you know, probably 99% of people are completely unaware of. All right, so future work with this. My plans for this work is to do two papers, an update of is homeschool cool, just looking at state by state growth and retention and participation comparisons, you know, as a report, and put that out. And then also looking a little bit more deeply at these retention ideas and possibly the school choice context in the states and how that may feed into these differences. We hope to do a series of state level reports and op-eds. Some states have a subgroup data, disaggregated data available where we can look at increases by grade level or age, gender, county or district, which I hope to be able to get at kind of some urbanicity, looking at where these increases are. So doing some of that sub-analysis, I think would be super interesting. And then we're looking for funding for this work. So if anyone listening would like to come alongside of us and partner, please reach out. I'm anxious for funding so I can add some more students to this work. And then I want to talk to you finally about this Hopkins Homeschool Hub. Do we have time, Albert?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And so, so this is in partnership with EdChoice. And the idea is very simple, but we're calling it the Hopkins Homeschool Hub. It will be a dedicated web page on the Institute for Education Policy website, where folks can go and access all of the data for the states in the United States, all of this participation data that we've talked about today. So, you know, I've already put in the work of collecting all of these data. In the United States, every time you want to research homeschooling, you have to go state by state. Every state's different. Every website's different. It takes hours and hours to dig up all of these data and ask people for things. And to compile this data set, it's very, very time consuming. So the idea here is that we are going to host the data so that people can look at their state of interest. They can look at all of the entire data set. It will be free and downloadable. So instead of a researcher wanting to research their home state or wanting to research a national context or a region, and they have to do all of the legwork themselves, it will already be done and they can just quickly download the information. We also hope to have a summary state by state. So we'll have like a national summary context and, you know, some of the national estimates and issues with that. And then a state by state summary where we'll summarize, you know, the political context, across sector comparisons, you know, the growth, the regulation for that state and what that looks like. And we're even going to include that type of information for states that we don't have data. So all 50 states will be in there. And then the actual participation data will just be for the states we're able to collect. But I'm interested to know from the research community what they would like to see, what maybe we're missing that could be included in there that would be easy to include and high value for researchers. And also current plans are not to include, we haven't thought really just about including anything on an international context, but I'm certainly open to it and wondering what might be interesting there, or you know, that may be a phase 2 or something of this project. So thank you very much. And I'm very interested to hear your questions and comments and any suggestions. Oh, and let me add too, I'm always interested in collaborating, and please feel free to email me. I'm glad to share emails and share ideas. And, you know, I'm the only one in my group that is researching homeschooling. And so I really need folks that are like-minded that I can discuss some of these issues with. So please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
Great. So Angela, on that note, I mean, there's a couple questions about people saying, "Oh, what's your email?" I don't know if you have a slide that shows it or something.
Yes, it's next. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, put that up just so people
There I am.
can see that. Yeah, so for instance, Jessica Parnell is asking, how do we send ideas for data sets? And I'm assuming, I guess the answer is to just contact you.
Sure, that's fine. Absolutely. And I'm also, well, there's my Twitter handle. I'm also on Twitter.
Yeah.
And LinkedIn.
So I'll just take moderator prerogative and ask the first question. And again, just if you're in the audience, remember there's a Q&A feature in your kind of control panel for Zoom. So feel free to put in your questions there or put it in the chat. And while you do, I guess I'll ask the first question, Angela. So I guess I'm a little curious to get into the weeds a little bit about how separate states classify homeschoolers. And so, some of my recent work has been, raising a lot of questions about actually what counts. And so do people who enroll in virtual programs count as homeschoolers? We've got the growth in hybrid homeschooling. Actually, just to pick on our state and our Northwest Arkansas here, Providence Academy, you've got families that send their kids to school 2-3 days a week, homeschool the rest of the couple of days. And so we're definitely evolving. And you do work on learning pods as well. And so that's all kind of changing how we think about homeschooling. So so kind of, can you walk us through across the states? Do those people count as homeschooling? What's the actual question or way separate states identify homeschoolers, and what implications might that have?
Yeah, so it is super complicated. As far as these data are concerned, I made the choice to report what the state reports. And so these are whatever the state calls homeschooling, and whoever signs up under that name is what we count for these data. But yeah, you're right. I believe it's Colorado, where, there are, they call them umbrellas. I'm sure folks are familiar with them. Umbrella private schools that you would enroll in a private school. So you're kind of under their protection. And then you homeschool and do your own thing. In other states, you have to file yourself as a private school. So I would be Angela Watson private school, homeschooling my two children and my neighbor's 2 kids. It gets very complicated. And all of the states are very different in how they do that. Some will have, it would be possible to, and it depends on what you call homeschooling, right? There's a lot of debate over that. I call them purists. Homeschooling purists would say that you are a homeschooler if you school your children at home and you direct all parts of their education, right? You choose the curriculum, you do the instruction, all the things. Other people would say, no, you're a homeschooler if your children are schooled at home and you direct it, but you have a tutor, or you're part of a homeschool co-op, and 3 days a week it's a teacher and 2 days a week it's supervised by mom or dad, right? And so there are a lot of differences, and it is difficult. I think, as far as this research is concerned, again, I use what the state says, and that's how we have to make a decision somewhere.
Yeah.
But I do think I think as far as policy implications, right? When you think that there are only, 1 or 2% of students are homeschooling, you can afford to ignore them, and they're just kind of noise in the policy background. But when you realize that 6% of students, the same number as are homeschooled or private, almost nearly as many as are private schooled nationally, you have to take notice.
Yeah.
And then you have to direct policy towards cleaning up some of that, or just having some sort of universal, non-traditional schooling and let everybody fall under that umbrella. I don't know what the right policy fix is, but it seems certainly like a policy question. And I think that having a good awareness of what the facts are on the ground, will then drive policy. And right now we clearly don't have that.
Yeah. I mean, just, a couple of folks chiming in and observing what you're observing, the complications of trying to get a clean snapshot and interpret what states are. So Jason Gates just put in the definition that's pretty much equivalent to your, I guess what you call PURIS, home-based parent-directed private education, in the chat. And Gail as well observes that, so it sounds like she runs an alternative private school, and all the families there homeschool, and so it gets kind of complicated.
Right.
So
anyway,
yeah,
back from the hybrid homeschooling conference, and then I mean it's if anybody attended that, it's wild to hear these are mostly practitioners who are either running really small, although some of them now have hundreds of students, but they started off as small private schools, but they also consider themselves homeschoolers. It's really interesting to see what kind of innovations people are making.
So let me so Jason Gates has another question here. Do you know, are you aware of any data that's been collected regarding parent motivation? So I think this is premised by, you mentioned like this retention rate, and there's some increases and decreases. So Jason's asking, has any data been collected regarding parents' motivations for transitioning to homeschooling in recent years? So do we know something about that? Is it just a pandemic story, or are there other things?
I mean, I do think it is a pandemic story. I haven't looked into that specifically. I know the Pulse data do have that. And I believe Ed Choice, they send out every couple of months survey to families. And one of the things they've asked them is, do they think everyone should be allowed to homeschool? Would they consider homeschooling? And then what reasons would they have? And so I know that there is information out there. I'm not super familiar with the reasons. I am interested, though, particularly the growth in Black and Brown communities has been really high during and since the pandemic. I think that's super interesting. And I'm really interested in looking at, how emerging communities in homeschooling are figuring out how to homeschool, and like the grassroots systems of how they're building that up. I think a lot of Black and Brown families really saw firsthand the way that many of their students were being failed by the public school system during COVID and during all of the Zoom, instruction. And so I think a lot of people have gotten out. I think there are a lot of, political reasons, problems with the curriculum not reflecting their values, problems with curriculum not reflecting their race or ethnicity, that people are opting out. And it's nice that they have an option that they can do something else. So it is very interesting.
Right, which I think is a good plug for, if you missed the previous webinar last month, we had Lisa Puga on to talking about her work with African-American homeschooling families. And so I asked the audience to just check it out on the GHEX website. You can access a recording of that. So maybe just a couple easier ones that are just kind of practical and logistical. So Jessica Parnell's asking, when do you anticipate having the 22-23 school year data available?
So I have a graduate student right now collecting all of that, and it just depends. Some of the states don't report those data until the summer. And this homeschool hub that we're working on, we hope to have it operational by in December. So by the new year, that should be up with all of the data, and then we'll update it twice a year as new data come out to make sure that people have access to things. But some of the 22-23 data are fully available, and then we're still collecting for other states.
Great. So there's a set of questions here that are all about just the interaction between the different sectors. And so I know you mentioned, you got a slide about how potential increase in another sector drives down homeschooling in another sector, or maybe for another reason, they might rise together or fall together, who knows? So I think there are a couple of questions on this line, and I'll just kind of run through these. So Marty Lucan's asking, are you aware of any data that would, well, do you know if homeschool growth differs between states with and without ESA programs?
No, I don't know that offhand, but I think it would be really interesting to look at, right? And now that I'm thinking, I mean, I think definitely we're set up to be able to look at that with Arkansas. Like, what a perfect situation.
Yeah.
We can watch because the roll up for the ESA is tiered over time, and so over 3 years it will open up to broader groups of students, and so we ought to be able to see if what I'm saying is true or not.
Yeah.
Looking at homeschool participation, it's completely plausible that whatever option folks are currently in, they stay in, and then as new options open up, people take advantage of those, and everything could grow. You know, that's completely plausible.
So states like oh, sorry, I was going to say, so now that there's a couple states that have universal ESAs, Arizona, Iowa, like Utah, right? I think you've got a difference analysis set up here,
right?
But actually, actually, I think you even have data to think about this now. I mean, so in Florida's had an ESA program for a while, and in Arizona, before they went universal, had theirs too. So you can kind of see it.
We might be able to look at retrospectively, right, at the longitudinal data. It's just difficult, but I mean, Marty is at EdChoice. Those folks may have this information. It's hard to see the participation percentages in prior years, but we could look at that and see, as the private funding use of private funding mechanisms went up, how did these other sectors fluctuate or not? Yeah, for sure.
I want to give Jason Gates kudos. He raised this exact question, I think, during the presentation before you showed the slide. So he was totally anticipating where you were going. So question from Christy Batts, more of an administrative data question. Just to the best of your knowledge, do any states follow students longitudinally? And so she's thinking about, is there a way to think about retention per student rather than kind of what you have, which is this overall rate, which, by the way, I think is important because, again, some of my recent work, we show that most people don't homeschool, in big chunks, right? Or they don't spend, people sometimes homeschool for a year or two and then go back and they go back and forth. So are you aware of, is there data out there that are going to let you be able to do that?
Not that I know of homeschool participation at student level. I don't think, I don't know. I don't think so. Not that I know of. We're pulling the policy right now for all the states. So, if we run across something that's student level, I mean, I assume that the states would have that, but they just don't report it. But it might be something that we could get, or that a researcher could get. Yeah, I support you in that, Christy. You figure that out.
Yeah,
Christy's the student that I was talking about that's in North Carolina. And and looking at
kind of want to
Carolina
ask the master the question.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, on that note, just a thought. I mean, so I think in some states like Pennsylvania, where students have to be tested, they've got to have that longitudinally as well. So, but again, I don't know how well you can navigate some of these state Department of Ed bureaucracies to get the data, but maybe that's an avenue. And I think you're
right, Albert. To your earlier point, I've got a paper that I'm working on right now too, using the Cardis data that looks at ever homeschooling versus always homeschooling. And this is another common stereotype that we think that these numbers are somehow, that these people are somehow static, but that is not what few data we have that could shed some light on that show that families move in and out of homeschooling, and even will homeschool one of their children and not the other, or for certain years with certain children within the same family. And so that's very common. And it's a misconception, again, that I think policymakers are not considering, and we have flawed policies when we don't fully understand the context.
So just a couple more questions. I guess maybe, well, this one's maybe more of a suggestion from your student, Christy Batts. So she says, how folks are using policy may be another interesting question after seeing how many people are being identified under the state definition. So does, I guess, yeah, do counts affect, I guess, how different states then take that data and do stuff with it?
Sure. I mean, well, again, I mean, I feel like people underestimate the importance of homeschooling in their policy decisions because they're still stuck in the track that that's only 1% to 2% and that they're always homeschoolers and they think they know, who those families are and what they look like. But, that has all changed and policymakers still have not updated their thinking and their policies. So yeah, I mean, I think that it probably negatively influences appropriate policy when we don't understand what's going on. And then, I mean, you really get to the point where you've got the same homeschool family that could be classified as legally classified as 3 different schooling modes. Like that's kind of crazy, and so, you get to the point where either you have to have very distinctive bins that you're going to put all these people in, or you just have to say, forget it, everybody do their thing and we'll call it alternative, education or whatever, and let them do what they're going to do. Yeah. But it's a difficult policy question, but I mean, it's a bramble of policy and yeah, and folks trying to figure out how to get around it. And yeah. I will say too, at the hybrid homeschool conference that I was at, I was talking to a woman. She homeschooled her children in early grades. And then in later grades, she private schooled them, still the same setup, same mom, same kids, but she registered as a private school in her state because they couldn't qualify for the Hope Scholarship, college scholarship monies if they came from a non-accredited whatever. And so as a private school, they could get this funding, right? So it's a real mess of policy.
Yeah, interesting. And then you brought in a completely different policy lever there that has no intent to do that, and right. It affects our families' behaviors. Right. So I know you're building the Hopkins Homeschool Hub, and it sounds like that's more, at least for the U.S., but you are open to thinking about building international data sets. So Gail, on that note, Gail Hanlon's asking, are you aware of any place where we can see international data like this? Like, how would you go about doing some of this work outside the U.S., perhaps?
Yeah, so I really have specialized only in the United States, so I haven't looked at all at international. I am interested in it, and I know that my boss is Dr. Ashley Berner. She studies educational pluralism and does a lot with international pluralism. So I know that is something she would also be very interested in supporting, would be some sort of work or increasing our knowledge of what things look like in other countries as well. So I'm open to it, but I have not studied it at all.
Okay. So I'm going to ask these last 2 questions here kind of combined because I think they're related. And so I'll read them to you. So Jason Gates is curious to hear more about your motivations for diving into homeschooling research. Just kind of tell your story there. So if you don't homeschool and aren't close friends with any people who do, how did you get interested in it? And then I think a related, well, actually, go ahead and why don't you, I'll give you the floor to share that.
So I always kind of fantasized about homeschooling my own kids, but I went back to school as a non-traditional student in my late 30s. And I had to completely start over at the very beginning of my bachelor's because I had to declare academic bankruptcy. It was a big drama. I had a toddler and a baby, and I went back to school. And so, it was impossible at that point to homeschool because I was in school, but it was something that I always kind of fantasized about doing. And I always joked that I thought that I could homeschool someone else's kids, just not my own kids. But it was something that I always was interested in. And I did know people that homeschooled at the time, especially when my children were younger. Then I got into my PhD graduate program, and no one was really researching homeschooling. And so I thought, this is interesting to me. I think it's very interesting. And it was a place where I could kind of carve out a niche where no one really was doing this work. And so that's how I initially got interested in it. And that went on for several years. And then COVID happened, and nobody was really that interested in Angela's homeschool work, because nobody was really that interested in homeschooling and in the broader education context. But as COVID started happening, the interest in homeschooling, and then all of these related innovations like learning pods, and especially at the heat of the pandemic, the learning pods were a huge thing. People got really, really interested. And so now, folks are very interested in homeschooling research. And I'm really loving, being involved in it. But, I haven't done it, and it is interesting. I was an expert witness in a school choice case. And, to not be an advocate, I think, is an asset for me as a witness in that case. And as a researcher, I don't really come to it with any preconceived, bias.
So the second question, which is kind of related, you've talked a lot about doing this research to inform policy, to kind of better understand policymakers. So Dorcas Ross is asking, has this study you conducted helped you understand homeschooling better, or has it raised more questions for you? So yeah, just you want to care to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think this particular work is just very factual, and so I don't necessarily think that has helped. I will say, though, no, that's not true. I think the Black and brown increases is extremely interesting. I'm really interested in looking at that. The other thing that I found that was really interesting, in the disaggregated data in Arkansas, we can see the bulk, like 80%, I'm making that up off the cuff, but I think that's pretty close. 80% of the growth in homeschooling during the pandemic was in early grades. And people immediately say, oh, well, that's because it's harder to teach chemistry to older kids. I'm like, no, that's not the reason, because if that was the reason, we would always see that there were way more children in homeschooling in early grades, but that's not the case. What we saw is a huge increase in early grades during COVID. And so I think that that's super interesting to look at and to think about why that might be. I think this work, looking at the comparisons across sectors, is super interesting, and that's something that I've definitely learned from, and I think is really important for other people to be aware of. So yeah, I mean, I've definitely learned a lot through this research. And then, the other paper, the Forever and Always paper, better understanding when people are homeschooled. And that paper too can look at their religiosity, their political leanings, so we start to develop a more accurate understanding of who homeschoolers are, right? That may not align with the common stereotypes that we've operated under for decades.
Yeah. Well, great. I'm looking forward to seeing the next iterations of this project. I think you mentioned this actually, it's an empirical fact. A lot of the influx of homeschooling and kind of, I guess the analog to that is the decrease in enrollment in public schools in the U.S. is at the early grades, as you mentioned. And so to see breakouts of these counts by grade over time, I think would be pretty insightful. And so curious to see the next iterations of this as you do more subgroup analyses. So anyway, thanks, Angela, for sharing this work. Really enjoyed getting to know what you're up to. Again, folks, you have her email. Feel free to reach out to her, talk about this research or the Hopkins Homeschool Hub. And so, Angela, thanks. It's good to see you. And best of luck as you continue this.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, folks, so that concludes our time. And have a great rest of the day or good evening if you're in another time zone. And we'll see you next time.